The arena floor stretched beneath Captain James Reeves like a sheet of polished obsidian, reflecting the 1,000 faces watching from above. Species from across the Galactic Covenant had gathered for this moment, some with multiple eyes, others with sensory organs humanity had no name for. All watched with the same expression, anticipation tinged with pity. James stood in the center circle, his hand resting on the pommel of his grandfather's cavalry saber. The weapon felt impossibly light compared to the quantum rifles and plasma lances he'd trained with at the academy. The leather grip, worn smooth by generations of hands, seemed almost fragile in this place of chrome and energy shields. Across from him, Warlord Kra'thex dominated the opposite circle. The Vraxian stood 3 meters tall, his chitinous exoskeleton gleaming like burnished copper under the arena lights. For arms hung at his sides, each capable of wielding a separate weapon. His combat honors, scored directly into his carapace as per Vraxian custom, covered nearly every surface of his body. Each mark represented a defeated champion, a conquered world, or a military innovation that had reshaped warfare across the galaxy. A sword, Kra'thex's voice boomed through the translators, his mandibles clicking with what the software interpreted as amusement. The human brings a sword to the proving grounds. Laughter rippled through the crowd. James heard it in a dozen different forms. Chittering, whistling, the deep rumble of gas giant dwellers. The universal language of mockery needed no translation. With respect, Warlord, James called back, his voice steady despite the weight of 10,000 eyes upon him. This blade has history. History. Kra'thex lifted one clawed hand, and a holographic display materialized above the arena. Images flickered past, fusion cannons, graviton disruptors, molecular unravelers. These are the weapons that write history now, human. Your ancestors cut each other with sharpened metal while barely comprehending fire. You dare bring their primitive tools to challenge me? The warlord's lower arms gestured, and his weapon materialized in a shimmer of light. The phase glaive was a masterwork of destructive engineering, a blade of contained antimatter suspended between 2 quantum field projectors. It could cut through any known material by simply unmaking the molecular bonds that held matter together. When Kra'thex activated it, the air around the weapon screamed. Humanity's petition for Covenant military command rests on this duel, Kra'thex continued, his tone shifting from mockery to something darker. You were told to bring your finest weapon. Instead, you insult this gathering with museum pieces. Do you think warfare is a game of sentimentality? James drew the saber slowly, letting the sound of steel against scabbard ring clear in the sudden silence. The blade caught the light, revealing the acid-etched inscription along its length. Through darkness, we endure. His great-great-grandfather had carried this weapon through the trenches of Earth's last World War. His grandfather had worn it at the ceremony when humanity first reached beyond their solar system. His father had held it the day the Covenant arrived with offers of membership and warnings of the dangers lurking in deep space. No, Warlord, James said quietly, settling into the opening stance his father had drilled into him since childhood. I think warfare is about understanding what you're fighting for. This blade has protected my family through wars you've only read about in your tactical databases. It survived when more advanced weapons turned to slag and memory. Kra'thex's compound eyes narrowed, the amusement draining from his posture. Then let us see if your nostalgia can withstand the present. The warlord raised his phase glaive, and the countdown began. Around them, the arena's safety fields hummed to life, containing what was about to unfold. In 3 languages, the arbiter's voice rang out, "Champions ready. Begin on my mark." James tightened his grip on the leather-wrapped hilt, feeling the pulse of his heartbeat through his palm. Somewhere in the crowd, Ambassador Winters was probably praying. The fate of humanity's military standing rested on what happened in the next few minutes. The arbiter's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Mark! The first exchange happened faster than most observers could track. Kra'thex moved with the efficiency of a being who had fought on 100 worlds. His phase glaive swept horizontally, the antimatter edge humming a song of annihilation. James dropped beneath the arc, feeling the heat wash over his back as molecules separated in the weapon's wake. He rolled forward, coming up inside the Warlord's guard. The saber flashed upward in a classic rising cut. Kra'thex's secondary arm intercepted with a forearm block that should have shattered the primitive blade against his reinforced exoskeleton. Instead, steel met chitin with a sound like a bell tolling, and the Warlord stumbled back 3 steps. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Kra'thex's face. "Impossible," the Warlord hissed. "Your weapon should have broken." James didn't waste breath on explanations. He'd spent the last 3 months preparing for this moment, researching everything about Vraxian combat doctrine, studying every recording of Kra'thex's previous duels. The Warlord was accustomed to opponents who relied on technology, shields, powered armor, weapons that required charging cycles and cooldown periods. He fought with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what his enemy could and couldn't do. But James's saber had no power source to deplete, no capacitors to drain, no ammunition to expend. It was just steel, balance, and the skill of the wielder. The second exchange began before the crowd could process the first. Kra'thex attacked with all 4 arms, the phase glaive weaving a deadly pattern while his free limbs struck with piledriver force. James gave ground, his blade singing as it deflected, parried, and redirected. Each impact sent vibrations through his arms, but the saber held. Because this wasn't just any steel. James's great-great-grandfather had been a metallurgist before the war, and in the quiet moments between battles, he'd worked the blade with techniques that predated industrial manufacturing. The saber had been folded, tempered, and edge-packed with a patience that modern fabrication had forgotten. Each atom had been coaxed into alignment through heat, hammer, and time. The Covenant's weapons were marvels of energy and exotic matter. They could unmake targets at the atomic level, project force across vast distances, bypass conventional defenses entirely. But they required infrastructure, power plants, maintenance facilities, supply chains of rare elements. Break those chains and the weapons became useless. The saber just needed someone who knew how to use it. "You move well," Kra'thex admitted, circling now with more caution. "But movement alone won't win this. You can't hurt me, human. My exoskeleton has withstood plasma fire. Your steel cannot penetrate it." "Maybe," James replied, watching the Warlord's stance. "But that's not the only way to win a fight." He'd studied Earth's ancient martial traditions during his preparation. Disciplines from cultures that understood blade work before gunpowder changed warfare forever. Japanese kenjutsu, European longsword techniques, the saber traditions of a dozen cavalries. Each had discovered the same fundamental truth. A blade wasn't just for cutting. It was for controlling space, reading intention, finding the gaps in an opponent's defense. Kra'thex lunged again, the phase glaive streaking toward James's center mass. Instead of retreating, James stepped forward and to the side, using the saber's flat to redirect the antimatter blade past his shoulder. The Warlord's momentum carried him forward, off balance for just a fraction of a second. James's pommel strike caught the joint between Kra'thex's primary and secondary arms. Chitin cracked. The Warlord roared and spun, but James was already moving, the saber's edge finding the gap where the exoskeleton plates met at the knee. It wasn't a killing blow. The armor there was still too thick. But it was a message. "I can reach you." The crowd's noise changed pitch. The mockery had died completely now, replaced by something closer to confusion. In the Covenant's thousands of years of recorded combat, primitive weapons were relics, ceremonial props. They didn't stand against modern warfare. They couldn't. Yet the human's blade was still intact, and the legendary Warlord Kra'thex was bleeding from a dozen small cuts where the edge had found the seams in his armor. "What is that weapon?" Kra'thex demanded, breathing hard now. "What technology powers it?" James smiled grimly. "No technology, Warlord. Just physics, metallurgy, and about 400 years of family tradition. My ancestors understood something your civilization forgot. Sometimes the oldest solutions are the best ones. Not because they're more powerful, but because they're more reliable." The Warlord's eyes narrowed. "Reliability means nothing against superior force. Then why am I still standing?" The arena had gone silent except for the clash of weapons and the heavy breathing of both combatants. What the crowd had expected to be a swift demonstration of Covenant superiority had transformed into something else entirely, a genuine contest between philosophies of war. Kra'thex shifted his grip on the phase glaive, and James recognized the change immediately. The warlord was abandoning his initial strategy of overwhelming force. Now he fought with calculation, treating the human not as an amusing curiosity but as a legitimate threat. The recognition sent a thrill through James's chest. This was what his ancestors had faced, enemies who underestimated them until it was too late to adapt. The Covenant had grown comfortable with their technological dominance, assuming their weapons guaranteed victory. But weapons didn't fight wars. Warriors did. "You're better than your reputation suggested," Kra'thex admitted, his combat stance tightening. The Covenant intelligence reports labeled humans as reckless, emotionally unstable. They said your species charges into danger without adequate preparation. "Sometimes recklessness and courage look the same from the outside," James replied, circling opposite to the warlord. "The difference is whether you survive." Kra'thex laughed, a harsh sound that needed no translation. "Wisdom from a primitive. Perhaps your species has more depth than we credited. Perhaps your species should have asked instead of assumed." The warlord struck without warning, the phase glaive moving in a complex pattern that should have been impossible to track. But James had spent 3 months watching footage of this exact sequence, the Vraxian death spiral, a technique that had ended the careers of 17 previous champions. He'd memorized every angle, every timing, every subtle tell in Kra'thex's stance that preceded each strike. His saber moved in counterpoint, not trying to match the phase glaive's reach but instead disrupting its rhythm. He attacked the weapon's balance points, forcing Kra'thex to adjust mid-strike. The antimatter blade seared past James's shoulder, missing by centimeters, then again past his hip. On the third pass, James didn't retreat. He stepped inside the arc of the phase glaive and drove his shoulder into Kra'thex's center mass. The impact would have broken a human's bones against that armored body, but it served its purpose. It bought a single second where the warlord's weapon was out of position. The saber's point found the gap between chest plates and drove deep. Kra'thex roared and backhanded James with one massive arm, sending the human tumbling across the arena floor. The saber stayed lodged in the warlord's armor, and for a moment, James thought he'd made a fatal error. A warrior without a weapon was just a target. But then Kra'thex reached for the blade, trying to extract it, and James saw his opening. He was moving before conscious thought caught up, crossing the distance between them in a sprint. As Kra'thex yanked the saber free, James caught it mid-air, the familiar weight settling into his hand like greeting an old friend. The cut that followed was pure instinct, a horizontal slash across the phase glaive's quantum field projectors. The saber's edge, honed to near-molecular sharpness by generations of careful maintenance, caught the projector housing at exactly the right angle. Sparks erupted. The antimatter containment flickered. Kra'thex deactivated the weapon before it could catastrophically fail, but the damage was done. The phase glaive was now just an expensive metal stick. "Impossible," the warlord breathed, staring at his disabled weapon. "The field projectors are reinforced with crystalline carbide. Nothing short of industrial equipment should be able to damage them." James lowered into guard position, his chest heaving. "That's the thing about impossible, warlord. It just means you haven't seen it done yet." For a long moment, they faced each other. The towering Vraxian warrior hung with the honors of 100 victories, and the human with his family's sword. The crowd held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then Kra'thex did something James hadn't anticipated. The warlord set aside his broken phase glaive and drew a secondary weapon from his harness. A simple blade, curved and wicked, forged from Vraxian battle steel. It was a weapon meant for honor duels, for fights where technology was stripped away and only skill mattered. "You've earned this much, human," Kra'thex said, his tone carrying a new respect. "Blade to blade, warrior to warrior. Let's finish this properly." James nodded, adjusting his grip on the saber. This was what he'd hoped for. Not a contest of technology, but a true test of skill. The kind of fight his ancestors would recognize. The kind of fight that would prove humanity's worth. They came together like thunder, and the real duel began. Blood slicked the arena floor, some red, some the deep amber of Raxian physiology. Both combatants moved more slowly now, their earlier speed sacrificed to exhaustion and injury. James's left arm hung uselessly at his side, the result of a Vraxian strike that had gotten past his guard. Kra'thex favored his right legs, the ones James had repeatedly targeted at the joints. But neither would yield. The fight had transcended its original purpose. This was no longer about Covenant politics or humanity's military standing. It had become something older, something primal, a contest of wills between two warriors who refused to break. James's saber work had devolved from the elegant techniques his father had taught him to something more desperate. He fought with the style of Earth's bloodiest conflicts, the muddy trench warfare where survival mattered more than form. Every parry was a hair too slow, every riposte a fraction less precise than it should have been. But Kra'thex was faltering too. The warlord's movements, once fluid and overwhelming, had become mechanical. His breath came in harsh gasps that rattled through his translator. The cuts James had inflicted, individually minor, had accumulated into a tapestry of damage that even Vraxian resilience couldn't ignore. "You should surrender," Kra'thex said. His blade locked against James's saber. They stood nearly chest to chest, the weapons between them singing with tension. "I've fought for 60 years, human. I've commanded fleets. I've conquered systems. You've fought well, but you cannot win." "Probably not," James admitted through gritted teeth. Sweat and blood ran down his face, stinging his eyes. "But my ancestors didn't surrender at Bastogne. They didn't surrender at the Somme. They sure as hell didn't surrender when the first colony ships lost navigation and drifted for 3 years in deep space. Surrender isn't in our vocabulary." He twisted, breaking the blade lock and spinning away. The saber's edge caught Kra'thex across the forearm, drawing another line of amber blood. The warlord's counterstrike grazed James's ribs, and he felt something crack beneath the impact. "Stubbornness isn't strength," Kra'thex growled, pressing the attack. "Neither is longevity." James gave ground, his footwork barely keeping him ahead of the warlord's blade. "You fought for 60 years, but how many of those fights actually tested you? How many pushed you past your limits?" The question seemed to strike deeper than any blade. Kra'thex's next strike came a fraction slower, as if the warlord was actually considering the words. "The Covenant has brought peace to 1,000 systems," Kra'thex said. "We've ended wars, established order. Our strength keeps the darkness at bay." "Your strength keeps you comfortable," James countered. He feinted high, then swept low, forcing Kra'thex to adjust. "You've forgotten what it means to fight when everything's on the line. To stand your ground when retreat makes more sense. To hold onto something because it matters, not because it's efficient. And what do you hold on to, human? That antique blade? The memory of ancestors you never met." James's response was immediate, coming from somewhere deeper than tactical thought. "I hold on to the idea that we're more than our technology. That humanity means something beyond our ships and weapons. That we're worth standing alongside the Covenant not because we can match your firepower, but because we remember what it costs to survive." He attacked then, pouring everything he had left into a combination his grandfather had taught him: high, low, thrust, the pattern designed to overwhelm an opponent's defenses through sheer aggression. Kra'thex blocked the first 2 strikes, but the third caught him in the shoulder joint, the saber's point sliding between plates to find soft tissue beneath. The warlord's bellow shook the arena. His own blade came around in a desperate arc, catching James across the chest and sending him sprawling. The saber skittered away across the polished floor. Both warriors lay there for a moment, lungs burning, bodies screaming for rest. Above them, the crowd had erupted into chaos. Some cheering, some protesting, all reacting to what they were witnessing. James forced himself to his knees, then his feet. Every movement felt like lifting a mountain. Across the arena, Kra'thex was rising too, using his blade as a crutch. They stared at each other, Two beings who had pushed past the limits of endurance into territory where only will mattered. "We could stop this," the warlord said quietly. "Call it a draw. Both sides keep their honor." James shook his head, stumbling toward where his saber lay. "That's not how this works. One of us has to win. That was the agreement." "Then you're a fool. We're both dying here." "Maybe." James's fingers closed around the saber's grip. The leather felt slick with blood, his own mostly. "But at least we'll die as warriors. Can you say the same for the Covenant's last 100 years of peace?" The words hung in the air like a challenge, and James saw something shift in Kra'thex's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or regret. "No," the warlord admitted. "No, I cannot." They faced each other one last time, blades raised, bodies failing, spirits unbroken. The end would come soon. They both knew it. The only question was what that end would mean. The final exchange lasted 3 heartbeats. James attacked first, his saber moving in a pattern born of desperation and muscle memory. His conscious mind had long since retreated. Only the training remained, the techniques drilled into him through 10,000 practice sessions. The blade moved as if independent of his failing body. Kra'thex met him blade to blade, and for a moment they were statues. 2 warriors frozen in perfect balance, neither able to overcome the other. Amber blood mixed with red on the arena floor. The crowd's roar had faded to a distant ocean sound. Then James did something his father had always warned him about. He released his guard. The saber dropped away from the blade lock, leaving him completely open. Kra'thex's weapon swept toward his chest in an arc that would end the fight instantly. But James had already committed to his gamble, trusting entirely in his read of the warlord's timing. He dropped to one knee as Kra'thex's blade passed through the space where his heart had been. The saber came up in a rising cut, using every ounce of strength James had left. The edge caught the underside of Kra'thex's primary arm, the only unarmored section, and the Vraxian blade went spinning away. For a moment, neither moved. Then Kra'thex sank to his knees, clutching his wounded arm. James remained kneeling as well, the saber's point resting against the floor, keeping him upright through sheer force of will. "Yield," James gasped. "Please." The warlord's compound eyes met his, and James saw something he hadn't expected: relief. "I yield," Kra'thex said clearly. "The human has won." The arena erupted. Above them, the crowd's reaction split along faction lines. Some celebrating, some protesting, all in shock. But James barely heard it. He was too busy trying to remember how to breathe. Medical teams swarmed onto the floor, attending to both combatants. As the medics worked on his wounds, James felt hands gently prying the saber from his grip. He wanted to protest, but his fingers wouldn't obey him anymore. "Easy, Captain," a voice said. Ambassador Winters, materializing from the crowd. "We've got you. You did it. You actually did it." "The blade," James managed. "Don't lose it. It's right here." She pressed the saber back into his hand, closing his fingers around the familiar grip. "Not going anywhere." Hours later, or perhaps days. His memory blurred. James woke in a medical bay. The ceiling was unfamiliar, all smooth curves and bioluminescent panels. Covenant design. His body felt distant, wrapped in the numbness of advanced medical technology. Awake at last. James turned his head to find Kra'thex in the next bed, similarly connected to medical equipment. The warlord looked smaller somehow despite his size. The weight of defeat perhaps, or simply the absence of armor and weapons. "How long?" James croaked. 2 days. Your injuries were extensive. The medics are still arguing about how you remained conscious during the final exchange. Kra'thex studied him with what might have been curiosity. "I need to ask you something, human. That last move, dropping your guard, it should have been suicide. How did you know I wouldn't kill you?" James considered the question. "I didn't. Not for certain. But I'd watched 50 hours of footage from your fights. You always hesitate for exactly 1/10 of a second when delivering a killing blow. Not out of mercy, out of respect. Giving your opponent one last chance to defend themselves. It's who you are. And if you'd been wrong, then I'd have died, and someone else would have taken my place tomorrow. Humans are stubborn that way. Kra'thex laughed, then winced at the pain it caused. Indeed, the Covenant Council has ratified humanity's petition. You'll have command authority in the Joint Defense Fleet. Congratulations, Captain. No, James said quietly. Congratulations to us both. You taught the Covenant something important. What's that? That winning isn't everything. You could have killed me a dozen times if you'd abandoned honor. Instead, you gave me a fight that proved what humans are capable of. James managed a weak smile. Sometimes defeat teaches more than victory. The warlord was silent for a long moment. Your weapon, he said finally. The saber. It bears an inscription. What does it say? Through darkness we endure. Appropriate. Kra'thex settled back against his medical bed. I think I'm beginning to understand why your ancestors carved those words into steel. Some truths are too important to store in databases. They need to be carried, passed down, held in your hand when everything else fails. My great-great-grandfather would have liked you, James said. The feeling would have been mutual. 3 months later, at the ceremony where humanity formally joined the Covenant's military command structure, James stood before the assembled representatives of 100 worlds. He wore his dress uniform, and at his side hung his great-great-grandfather's saber in a place of honor. When his turn came to speak, he kept it brief. My ancestors fought with these blades when humanity was confined to a single world. They carried them across stars when we barely understood what we were reaching for. I carried one into the arena because I wanted to remind everyone, including myself, that we're not defined by our technology. We're defined by what we're willing to stand for when the technology fails. He drew the saber, letting light play along the acid-etched inscription. This blade has carved my family's history for 4 centuries. Now it's carved into the Covenant's history too. Not because it's superior to your weapons, it's not, but because it represents something that can't be upgraded or replaced. The will to endure, to adapt, to survive regardless of the odds. James sheathed the blade. Humanity joins the Covenant not as supplicants or conquerors, but as partners. We bring our stubbornness, our adaptability, and our memories of what it cost to reach this moment. In return, we ask only that you remember something. The oldest weapons aren't always the weakest ones. Sometimes, they're the ones that have survived because they work. The applause that followed was genuine, if somewhat bewildered. These were beings who measured technological advancement in centuries, who viewed progress as inevitable and linear. The idea that something ancient could be valuable was almost alien to them. But in the front row, Warlord Kra'thex stood and placed his 4 fists over his hearts in the Vraxian salute of supreme respect. Around him, others began to rise. Slowly at first, then faster as the gesture spread through the crowd. Later, as the ceremony dissolved into diplomatic receptions and political maneuvering, James found himself alone on a balcony overlooking the Covenant capital. The city stretched to the horizon, a forest of towers and flying vehicles that made Earth's greatest cities look primitive by comparison. Ambassador Winters joined him, carrying 2 glasses of something that probably wasn't champagne but served the same purpose. Quite a view. Yeah. James accepted the glass. Makes you think about scale. We're one small species among thousands now. Our entire history is a footnote in Covenant records. Is it, though? James touched the saber at his side. Or have we just proven that footnotes can reshape the narrative? Winters smiled. The Council has been receiving requests. Other species want to learn about human combat techniques, traditional weapons training. There's talk of establishing an academy. They want to learn sword fighting. They want to learn what the sword represents. The Council's been comfortable for too long. You reminded them that comfort makes you vulnerable. James sipped his drink, watching ships trace paths across the alien sky. My great-great-grandfather survived a war that should have killed him. My grandfather helped establish humanity's first extrasolar colony against impossible odds. My father taught me that the tools matter less than the hand that wields them. And what will you teach your children? He smiled. That history isn't something you read about, it's something you carry. Every day in everything you do, sometimes literally. He patted the saber. And that no matter how advanced we become, we should never forget where we came from. Because the day we forget our history is the day we stop understanding what we're fighting for. Far below, the Covenant capital continued its eternal rhythm of progress and change. But on the balcony, James Reeves stood with his ancestors' blade at his side, a reminder carved into steel and carried across the stars. Some weapons were meant to kill, others were meant to remember. His had done both, and in doing so had carved humanity's name into galactic history, not through conquest or submission, but through the simple act of refusing to forget who they were. The saber would pass to his children someday, carrying with it the story of the duel that changed everything. And generations hence, when humanity had spread to 1,000 worlds and the Covenant was just another chapter in the long book of civilization, someone would draw that blade and read the inscription. Through darkness we endure. Some truths, it turned out, were sharper than any technology could forge. And some blades never dulled.